Drunk and frustrated, Daniel gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black Mercedes, his mind clouded by the heavy whiskey he had downed at the club. The neon lights of the city blurred past as he sped down the empty streets, his anger bubbling with every thought of his father. Once again, the old man had humiliated him, comparing him to his younger brother, the golden child, the perfect one. To make matters worse, he had just lost a major contract, a failure that only added fuel to his father's scorn. His grip tightened as he swerved into the driveway of his estate, the grand mansion towering before him, its golden-lit entrance almost mocking his misery. He shoved the car into park, exhaling heavily before staggering out, his balance unsteady. "Damn it," he muttered, rubbing his temple as a fresh wave of dizziness hit him. Just as he turned towards the house, a faint sound made him pause. He frowned, listening. Help. Please, someone help me. Forced marriage. Daniel's sluggish brain struggled to process what he had just heard. His gaze darted around, searching for the source. Then, his heart lurched. The sound had come from his car. His pulse spiked as he spun around, staring at the trunk. Was this some kind of joke? His drunken mind reeled. Who the hell? With shaky hands, he pressed the trunk release. The lid popped open with a soft click, and before he could react, a figure shot up, gasping for air. A young woman. Her dark, wavy hair was a tangled mess, her expensive dress wrinkled and stained. Her wide, terrified eyes met his, and she clutched the edge of the trunk, panting. Daniel blinked, trying to make sense of the scene in front of him. "Who? Please!" she choked out, her voice trembling. "Don't take me back! I can't marry him! He'll destroy me!" Daniel took a step back, the alcohol-induced fog in his brain lifting slightly. "What the hell is going on?" The woman's lips quivered as she looked at him with desperation. "I ran away. Please, don't let them take me back." Daniel let out a sharp breath, dragging a hand down his face. Whatever mess this girl was in, he had just walked right into it. You were in my trunk?" She nodded frantically. "I had no choice. I had to hide." Daniel let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Unbelievable. I drove straight from the club to here, and you're telling me you've been in there the whole time." "I must have fallen asleep," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where the car would take me." Daniel studied her for a moment. She didn't look like a criminal, just a terrified girl in a ruined wedding dress. He sighed. "All right, you're safe now. But you need to explain everything. No nonsense." She nodded eagerly. "I will, but can I at least come inside? I'm freezing." Daniel hesitated, running a hand through his hair before nodding toward the house. "Fine, but start talking." As soon as Daniel led the young woman inside, he gestured toward the couch before making his way to the kitchen. His head was still spinning from the alcohol, and his mind was struggling to process everything that had just happened. "Water," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel paused, glancing over his shoulder. He hadn't even asked if she needed anything. He sighed, grabbed a glass, filled it with cold water, and handed it to her before collapsing into the armchair across from her. "All right," he exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Start talking." She gripped the glass tightly, her fingers trembling slightly as she took a sip. "My father. He's forcing me to marry a man I don't love." Daniel raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "He's rich. A billionaire," she added bitterly. "He promised to fund my father's political campaign in exchange for me." Daniel let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "So, what did you do? You ran?" She nodded, her grip tightening around the glass. "I escaped from the wedding venue before they could officially hand me over. I had no plan, I just ran. I didn't even know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay." Daniel watched her carefully. There was something in her eyes, a mix of desperation and exhaustion. She was terrified, yet determined. "Are you hungry?" he asked after a moment, noticing how her gaze lingered on the leftover bread on the kitchen counter. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to refuse, but the hunger in her eyes betrayed her. "I'm fine," she said, though her stomach seemed to disagree, letting out a faint growl. Daniel smirked and stood up. "You're a terrible liar." She dropped her gaze as he walked into the kitchen. He grabbed the bread, some butter, and set about preparing something quick. "So," he said, slicing through the bread, "what's your plan? You just gonna keep running?" Jessica sighed, her fingers curling around the hem of her dress. "I don't know," she admitted. "I didn't think that far ahead, She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I need you to take my virginity." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. The knife in Daniel's hand slipped. A sharp hiss escaped his lips as the blade sliced through his palm. Jessica gasped, her eyes widening in horror as blood welled up from the deep cut. "Oh my God!" Daniel just stood there, staring at his bleeding hand in shock, as if his brain hadn't caught up with what had just happened. Jessica rushed to his side, grabbing his hand gently as she pressed a napkin against the wound. Her fingers trembled slightly, her breathing uneven. For a second, neither of them spoke. Their eyes met, and the air between them grew heavy, charged with something unspoken. Then Daniel blinked rapidly, finally snapping out of his daze. "Oh my God, my blood." Jessica exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "We need to clean this up." She held onto his hand, trying to stop the bleeding, her grip firm yet careful. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice quieter now. "You really just threw yourself into a stranger's house and then—" He shook his head, still trying to process her words. Jessica met his gaze again, her eyes uncertain but determined. "It was either this or marrying a man who sees me as nothing more than a business deal." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then sighed, his lips twitching into a half-smile. "Well, you sure know how to make an entrance." Jessica's face burned with shame, but she forced herself to continue. "Chief Adekunle believes that virgins bring him power and wealth. It's part of his twisted traditional beliefs. He thinks they are a blessing." Daniel, still pressing a napkin to his injured palm, exhaled sharply, his expression unreadable. "Let me get this straight," he muttered, finally turning to face her. "You want me, a total stranger, to sleep with you just so this deranged old man will lose interest?" Jessica swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. "Yes." Daniel let out a dry, humorless chuckle and leaned forward, placing his glass down on the counter. "You've lost your damn mind." She flinched but didn't back down. "Please, Daniel, I'm begging you." His gaze lingered on her, really taking her in. She was beautiful, no doubt. Dark, expressive eyes, full lips, a soft glow to her skin, despite the exhaustion written all over her face. She wasn't bad. Not at all. But he wasn't going to do it. His jaw tightened as an old memory surfaced, one he'd tried to bury. The last time he had let himself get intimate with a random woman, it had almost ruined his life. He had met her at a club, a fun night that had turned into a nightmare. He hadn't known she was asthmatic. He had woken up to her gasping for breath, clutching at her throat, unable to speak. He had panicked, called an ambulance, and done everything he could. But for those terrifying minutes, he had thought she would die, right there in his bed. He had barely escaped getting detained. And of course, his father had been livid. Another mistake. Another disappointment. Daniel shook his head, forcing the memory away. He wasn't going down that road again. "I don't take advantage of women in desperate situations," he said firmly. Jessica's lips parted, her breath shaky. "Then what do I do?" Daniel rubbed his jaw, thinking. "First, you stay here, at least until we figure something out. Second, we make sure that bastard never finds you." For the first time since stepping into his house, Jessica exhaled in relief. She took a tiny step closer to him, her presence warm in the small space of the kitchen. Daniel turned, picking up the plate of food he had prepared and handing it to her. "Eat." She hesitated before taking it from him, her fingers grazing his. A tiny spark of something flickered between them, something unspoken. Daniel cleared his throat and turned his back to her, reaching for a bottle of wine from the counter. He poured himself a generous glass, swirling the liquid as he took a deep breath. Jessica, still standing behind him, watched him carefully. The man was a mystery, cold, sharp-tongued, but there was something else underneath all that. A quiet burden he wasn't willing to talk about. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel took a sip of his wine, not turning around. "Don't thank me yet. This mess is just getting started." Jessica's hands trembled as she set the empty plate aside, her gaze fixed on Daniel. There was desperation in her eyes, a silent plea that refused to fade. "Daniel, please," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "You don't understand. Chief Adekunle isn't just some wealthy old man, he's powerful. If he finds me, my parents will suffer for this, and so will I." Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. He had already made his stance clear, but she was still pleading. "I told you," he said firmly, meeting her gaze. "I'm not going to take advantage of you, no matter how desperate you are." Jessica looked down, gripping the hem of her dress. "Then what do I do?" Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "You stay here for now. We'll figure something out in the morning." She nodded slowly, though the fear in her eyes hadn't fully disappeared. Daniel waited until she had finished eating before standing up. "Come on," he said, gesturing for her to follow. She trailed behind him as he led her down the hallway, stopping in front of a guest room. He pushed open the door, revealing a neatly arranged space with a soft, inviting bed and a dimly lit lamp casting a warm glow. "This is where you'll sleep," he said, stepping aside. Jessica hesitated at the doorway, glancing back at him. "Thank you," she murmured. Daniel let out a quiet sigh, then reached into a drawer, pulling out one of his oversized t-shirts. He handed it to her. "You should change into something comfortable," he said. "Try to get some rest." She took the shirt, gripping the fabric tightly as though it was another form of reassurance. Daniel took a step back, watching her for a moment. "We'll talk in the morning. Get some sleep." With that, he turned and walked out, closing the door behind him. As he made his way to his own room, he exhaled heavily, rubbing his face. His life had been chaotic before, but now, it was a whole new level of complicated. Daniel let out a long sigh as he stepped into his bedroom, shutting the door behind him. The weight of the night pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had barely wrapped his head around the fact that he had a runaway bride hiding in his house, and now he was responsible for keeping her safe from a powerful man who saw her as nothing more than a token of wealth. Stripping off his shirt, he stepped into the bathroom, turning on the shower. The hot water cascaded over his tense muscles, soothing his exhaustion but doing little to clear his mind. He let his hands rest on the tiled wall, his thoughts drifting to the past. His mother. After finishing his shower, he wrapped a towel around his waist and walked toward his dresser. His gaze instinctively fell on the framed photograph sitting by his bedside. His late mother's warm smile stared back at him, her eyes filled with the kind of love he hadn't felt in years. She had always admired his strength, always told him he had a good heart. "You can be anything, Daniel," she would say. "Never let anyone make you feel less." But his father had done the exact opposite. The old man never failed to remind him of his shortcomings, always measuring him against his younger brother. It wasn't enough that they were family. His father had turned them into rivals, planting seeds of resentment between them. No matter what Daniel did, it was never enough. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He had spent his entire life trying to prove himself, but for what? Just as he was about to slip into bed, a faint noise reached his ears. His body tensed. He listened, his sharp instincts kicking in. The sound wasn't from outside. It was coming from inside the house. His heart hammered as he grabbed a t-shirt, pulling it over his head before striding towards the door. He stepped into the hallway, moving swiftly and silently, his senses on high alert. As he descended the stairs, the dim lighting from the wall sconces illuminated the figure standing near the corridor, hesitantly glancing around as Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. "Jessica, what are you doing?" She shifted on her feet, gripping the fabric of the shirt. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The wedding, the way my father looked at me like I was nothing more than a transaction." She swallowed hard. I felt suffocated. Daniel studied her for a long moment, his chest tightening. The vulnerability in her eyes, the way she stood there, hesitant yet desperate for comfort, it pulled at something deep inside him. He sighed, stepping closer. "You're safe here. No one is going to take you." Jessica bit her lip, glancing down. "I know, but..." She hesitated. Can I stay with you? Just for tonight?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He wasn't blind to the effect she had on him. She was beautiful, and standing there in nothing but his shirt wasn't helping. But more than that, she was scared, alone, and completely out of options. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just to sleep, Jessica. That's it." She nodded quickly. "I promise." Without another word, he turned, leading her back upstairs. As they entered his room, Daniel pulled back the blanket. "Get in," he said, his voice low. Jessica hesitated for only a second before climbing onto the bed, curling up on one side. Daniel sighed and lay beside her, keeping a safe distance between them. As he reached over to turn off the lamp, he felt the warmth of her presence beside him, her soft breathing the only sound in the quiet room. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just thinking about himself, and somehow, that terrified him. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a golden hue over the room. Daniel stirred, shifting slightly under the covers, his body still heavy with sleep. But something felt different. A presence. A warmth. As his eyes fluttered open, he was met with a sight that nearly stopped his heart. Jessica. Her face was inches from his, her wide, dark eyes staring at him with an intensity that sent a jolt through his chest. For a split second, he thought he was still dreaming. But then he felt it. Her breath against his lips, her warmth so dangerously close. His pulse spiked. "Jessica?" His voice was hoarse, thick with sleep. She didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, she whispered, "I want you." Daniel's entire body locked up. Her voice was soft yet firm, filled with a desperate plea. "Please," she murmured barely above a breath. "Do this before it's too late." His mind was screaming at him to move, to push her away, to put distance between them before this went too far. But her proximity, her warmth, her scent, the way her body lightly pressed against his, made rational thought a challenge. Everything in him urged him to grab her, to pull her beneath him and make her his. The hunger in her eyes mirrored something primal inside him, something he had spent years keeping in check. Her legs shifted over his, soft and warm against his skin. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Damn it. Before he could process his next move, her lips brushed against his, tentative at first, as if testing the waters. It was soft, hesitant, but enough to send fire coursing through his veins. His restraint cracked. His hand moved instinctively, fingers threading into her silky hair as he deepened the kiss. She melted into him, her hands gripping his shoulders as if anchoring herself. His free hand skimmed her back, feeling the delicate curve of her body beneath the oversized t-shirt she wore. A soft whimper escaped her lips, and it sent something dangerously possessive through him. His grip tightened. This was reckless, dangerous, and yet He couldn't stop himself from kissing her back, from drinking in the way she trembled against him, until reality came crashing down. With every ounce of willpower he had left, Daniel pulled back, his breathing uneven. His forehead pressed against hers as he struggled to steady himself. Jessica's eyes were glazed with emotion, her lips swollen from their kiss. "Why did you stop?" she whispered, her fingers still curled against his chest. Daniel exhaled sharply, forcing himself to break the physical connection. He ran a hand through his already tousled hair, his heart still hammering against his ribs. "Because," he said, his voice rough, "this isn't right." Jessica's face fell slightly, confusion flickering in her gaze. "I told you," he continued, his tone gentler now. "I won't take advantage of you. No matter how much you think this will fix everything, it won't." He sighed, rubbing his thumb against his temple. "I know you're scared. I know you feel trapped. But it's not the way out." Jessica swallowed, her expression conflicted. Daniel cupped her face, his thumb brushing softly against her cheek. "You don't have to do this to be free," he murmured. "You're more than what they want to make you." Her eyes welled up, but she quickly blinked the tears away. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of unspoken emotions hanging thick in the air. Then, Daniel let out a shaky breath, forcing a smirk. "Come on, we need coffee, and maybe some distance before I completely lose my mind." Jessica let out a soft, nervous laugh, wiping at her eyes. The night had been strangely peaceful. After everything that had happened, the desperation, the heavy conversations, and the near breaking of boundaries, Jessica and Daniel had found themselves sitting in the living room, watching a movie neither of them truly paid attention to. The glow of the television flickered against their tired faces, filling the silence between them. Jessica sat curled up at one end of the couch, her legs tucked beneath her. She stole glances at Daniel, who lounged on the other end, his arm resting lazily over the backrest. They had no words left for the night. The exhaustion eventually won, and without realizing it, they both drifted into sleep right there in the living room, the soft hum of the TV lulling them into unconsciousness. Morning. The reckoning. Jessica stirred first, slowly waking to the gentle warmth of morning light filtering through the curtains. She blinked against the brightness, her mind taking a few moments to adjust to where she was. Then she remembered. She turned her head slightly, her breath catching when she saw Daniel still asleep beside her. His features, usually sharp with sarcasm or annoyance, were softer in sleep. The strong line of his jaw, the faint stubble on his face, the way his lips parted slightly with each even breath, it all struck her in a way she hadn't expected. For a moment, she let herself watch him, but then reality kicked in. She needed money. She had no idea how long she could stay here. She had no plan, no resources, no guarantees that Daniel would continue helping her. And if he wasn't going to give her the help she had asked for, she needed to find another way. Her eyes flickered down to his pocket. A wallet. Her heartbeat quickened. This is my chance. She hesitated only briefly before slowly sitting up. She moved carefully, silently, keeping an eye on him as she reached toward his pocket. Her fingers grazed the fabric, slipping inside just enough to pull out the wallet. Holding her breath, she flipped it open. Empty. Not a single bill. No cards. Nothing. Her stomach dropped. Looking for something? Jessica froze. Her head snapped up, her heart hammering in her chest. Daniel was awake. His voice was thick with sleep, but there was no mistaking the amusement in his eyes. He had been watching her the whole time. She swallowed hard, her fingers still gripping the useless wallet. I wasn't... Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before sitting up fully. Don't lie to me, Jessica. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm. She exhaled shakily before finally admitting, If you won't help me, I need someone who will. Daniel studied her, his gaze sharp yet unreadable. So your next plan was to steal from me? Jessica clenched her fists. I don't have a choice. He scoffed, shaking his head. You always have a choice. She looked at him with frustration, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Then tell me, Daniel, what am I supposed to do? Just sit here and wait for them to find me? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he held her gaze. Number, but running blindly is just going to get you caught faster. Jessica bit her lip, her breath uneven. You don't understand what they'll do to me if they find me. Daniel sighed, dragging a hand through his messy hair. Then let's make sure they don't. She searched his face for deception, but there was none. For the first time, she felt something other than panic, something dangerously close to hope. And then, bang! 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 The loud, forceful pounding on the front door shattered the moment. Both of them froze. Jessica's face went pale, her body stiffening as terror flashed in her eyes. Daniel's sharp gaze snapped toward the door, his muscles immediately tensing. Another heavy knock, then another. Shadows moved against the window. Jessica's breathing turned shallow. Her fingers instinctively clutched the fabric of Daniel's shirt. Oh my God, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's jaw clenched, his mind racing. Had they found her? What do you think? Who do you think is at the door? What will Jessica and Daniel do next? Watch out for part 2. Subscribe, like, and comment. Thanks for watching.